Officer Miller didn't see a person when he looked at Sarah. He saw a target. He saw a woman in a simple tracksuit pushing a high-end stroller in an exclusive gated community, and in his mind, she didn't belong. He didn't care that the baby was laughing. He didn't care that the sun was shining. He wanted her out of his neighborhood. When he slammed the handcuffs onto Sarah's wrists in front of the neighborhood kids, he thought he was teaching a lesson to a lowly nanny. He was smug. He was laughing. He even whispered in her ear that people like her should stay on their side of the tracks. What Officer Miller didn't know was that he wasn't arresting a nanny. He was arresting the woman who owned the $10 million mansion behind them. He was arresting a woman who sits on the federal bench and signs the very warrants that keep his precinct running. And in exactly 60 minutes, Officer Miller wasn't just going to lose his badge, he was going to lose his entire world. Before we dive into this incredible story of justice and the ultimate power shift, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the dark side of Luna. Here we expose the truths hidden in the shadows and celebrate the resilience of those who refuse to be broken. You won't want to miss what happens next. The neighborhood was called The Oaks. It was the kind of place where the grass is perfectly manicured and the silence is expensive. Sarah had moved here 3 months ago, seeking a quiet place to raise her daughter after a decade of high-pressure legal battles in Washington, D.C. To her neighbors, she was a mystery. She kept to herself. She dressed simply. She spent her mornings pushing a stroller and her nights reading over thick legal briefs in her study. On this Tuesday, the air was crisp. Sarah was singing a lullaby to her daughter Maya. She felt at peace, but that peace was shattered by the screech of tires. Officer Miller had been patrolling the Oaks for 5 years. He considered himself the gatekeeper. When he saw Sarah, he didn't see a neighbor. He saw an intruder. He pulled his cruiser onto the sidewalk, blocking her path. "ID," he barked, not even stepping out of the car at first. Sarah stopped. She looked at the officer, her expression calm but firm. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" "I said ID. Now, we've had reports of suspicious activity. You don't look like you live around here. Who are you working for?" Sarah knew her rights better than any man in that uniform ever could. She knew that without reasonable suspicion of a crime, she didn't have to show him anything. "I live here, officer, and I'm going to continue my walk." That was the spark that lit the fire. Miller stepped out of the car. He was 6'2", towering over her. He used his shadow to try and intimidate her. "Listen, girl, I know the type. You're the help, and the help doesn't talk back to me. Now show me your papers or you're going to the station for obstructing justice." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, but her voice remained like ice. "You are making a very large mistake, Officer Miller. I suggest you get back in your car and think about your next move very carefully." Miller laughed. It was a cold, mocking sound. He reached for his belt. "Oh, I've thought about it. You're under arrest." In front of 3 neighbors who had come out onto their porches to watch, Miller spun Sarah around. He pushed her face against the cold metal of his cruiser. He tightened the cuffs until they bit into her skin. He didn't see the woman who had graduated top of her class at Harvard. He didn't see the woman who had been appointed by the president. He saw someone he thought he could break. At the precinct, Miller was a hero. He told the other guys he caught a trespasser, giving him attitude. They left Sarah in a holding cell for 3 hours. No water, no phone call. Finally, the sergeant walked in. He looked bored. He looked at the intake sheet. "Sarah Jenkins?" he asked. "It's Judge Jenkins," Sarah replied, sitting perfectly straight on the wooden bench. The sergeant paused. He looked at her. Then he looked at the computer. He typed in her name. He stopped. Then he typed it again. His face went from bored to ghostly white. "Miller!" the sergeant screamed. His voice cracked. "Get in here! Now!" The next 10 minutes were a blur of panic for the department. The chief of police was called in from his vacation. The mayor was on the line. Miller tried to lie. He tried to say she was aggressive. But Sarah had been wearing a small, high-tech, discreet recording device, a habit from her days as a federal prosecutor. She played the audio, the racial slurs, the threats, the sound of her daughter crying while he laughed. Justice didn't just come. It arrived like a landslide. Sarah didn't just sue for the arrest. She dismantled the entire precinct's culture. By the time she was done, Miller wasn't just fired. He was indicted for civil rights violations. The air in the precinct didn't just turn cold, it became suffocating. The sergeant, a man who had spent 30 years navigating the murky waters of local politics, felt the floor dropping out from under him. He stared at the screen, then at the woman sitting calmly in his intake room. She wasn't disheveled. She wasn't broken. She looked like a predator that had finally let the trap snap shut. "Miller," the sergeant whispered, his voice trembling with a rage that surpassed anything he'd felt in his career. "Get the keys, now." Miller, still oblivious to the magnitude of the cliff he had just walked off, frowned. "Sarge, we haven't even finished the paperwork. She's been resisting." "Keys!" the sergeant screamed, slamming his fist onto the metal desk so hard a coffee mug shattered on the floor. The precinct went silent. Every officer, every clerk, and every person in the waiting room froze. Miller fumbled with his belt, his hands shaking as the first seed of doubt began to sprout in his mind. He unlocked the door to the intake room. Sarah didn't stand up immediately. She waited. She let the silence stretch until Miller was visibly sweating. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice low and melodic, echoing off the cinder block walls. "Do you remember what you told me in the back of that cruiser? You told me that people like me don't have a voice in your town. You told me that my guest pass had expired." She stood up slowly, smoothing out her tracksuit as if it were a $1,000 robe. "I want you to look at that monitor behind your sergeant. I want you to read the name on that federal commission. Because that guest you just assaulted, she's the one who decides if your department receives federal funding next year. She's the one who reviews the civil rights complaints that you've been bearing for a decade." Miller's eyes drifted to the screen. He saw the official portrait. He saw the gold seal of the United States. He saw the words, "The Honorable Sarah Jenkins." The blood drained from his face so quickly he had to lean against the doorframe to keep from collapsing. He wasn't just looking at a woman he had wronged. He was looking at the end of his pension, the end of his reputation, and the beginning of a prison sentence. I didn't know," Miller managed to choke out. "That," Sarah said, stepping toward him until they were inches apart, "is exactly the problem. You only treat people with dignity when you think they have the power to destroy you. Today, you guessed wrong." As Sarah walked toward the exit of the precinct, the atmosphere didn't just change. It disintegrated. The heavy industrial doors of the station felt like the jaws of a trap that had accidentally caught a lion instead of a lamb. The younger officers, who only 30 minutes ago had been leaning against the water cooler, joking and high-fiving Miller about his big catch, now looked anywhere but at Sarah. They stared at their keyboards, their boots, the flickering fluorescent lights, anything to avoid the piercing, judicial gaze of the woman they had just allowed to be humiliated. They knew the blue wall of silence, that unwritten, ironclad rule that dictates an officer must protect his brother in arms at all costs. But they also knew that the blue wall was made of brick and mortar, while Sarah Jenkins was made of something much harder. She was the law personified, and the wall was already showing deep, jagged cracks. The sergeant, desperate to save his own skin, scrambled around his desk. He reached out, his hand trembling, trying to grab Sarah's arm to offer a frantic, hollow apology. "Judge Jenkins, please. If we could just sit down in my office, we can make this right. It was a chaotic morning, a lapse in judgment." Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. She didn't turn around, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Do not touch me, Sergeant," she said, her voice a low, vibrating hum that commanded absolute silence. "Every hand that touched me today, every officer who laughed while my daughter screamed in that cruiser, and every person in this room who looked the other way, you are all going to be accounted for. You won't be answering to me in a hallway. You will be answering to a federal prosecutor under the bright lights of a deposition." Out of the lead SUV stepped Marcus Jenkins. To the public, he was Senator Jenkins, a man of poise, a master of policy, and a leading voice for police reform. But to the men in that precinct, he was the nightmare they had spent years trying to avoid. He didn't come in shouting. He didn't come in waving his arms. He walked with a slow, predatory grace that was far more terrifying than any scream. He met Sarah halfway across the parking lot. He didn't say a word at first. He just looked at her wrists, where the heavy steel handcuffs had left angry, red welts on her skin. The sight of it transformed him. Out of the lead SUV stepped Marcus Jenkins. To the public, he was Senator Jenkins, a man of poise, a master of policy, and a leading voice for police reform. But to the men in that precinct, he was the nightmare they had spent years trying to avoid. He didn't come in shouting. He didn't come in waving his arms. He walked with a slow, predatory grace that was far more terrifying than any scream. He met Sarah halfway across the parking lot. He didn't say a word at first. He just looked at her wrists, where the heavy steel handcuffs had left angry red welts on her skin. The sight of it transformed him. The politician vanished and the protector took his place. He pulled a coat over her shoulders, his eyes never leaving the precinct doors. Behind him, 4 men in dark suits stepped out of the secondary vehicles. They didn't have local badges. They had the cold, clinical eyes of the FBI's Civil Rights Division. The sergeant came stumbling out of the building, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of peace. "Senator, I am so sorry for the confusion. We are conducting an internal review as we speak." Marcus Jenkins looked through the sergeant as if he were made of glass. He pulled out his phone, pressed a single button, and held it up so the sergeant could see the caller ID. "The governor is on the line," Marcus said, his voice flat and terrifyingly calm. "He isn't calling for an apology. He's calling to find out why I shouldn't send the National Guard to lock down this entire zip code. You have exactly 5 minutes to clear a path, or this precinct becomes a federal crime scene." By the time Sarah and Marcus returned to the quiet, oak-lined safety of their estate, Sarah wasn't interested in resting. She sat in her high-backed leather chair in the study, the glowing screens of her monitors reflecting in her dark eyes. She felt the phantom weight of the handcuffs still on her wrists, but she channeled that pain into precision. She unlatched the discreet, high-tech smartwatch from her wrist. To the untrained eye, it looked like a luxury timepiece. To Officer Miller, it was the digital noose that would hang his career. Sarah opened a secure portal to the Department of Justice and began the upload. "Are you sure you want to be the one to lead this?" Marcus asked, leaning against the doorframe, a glass of water in his hand. "I'm not leading it, Marcus," Sarah replied, her fingers flying across the keys. "The truth is, leading it. I'm just the messenger." As the file finished uploading, she hit play. The audio was crystal clear. It captured the whistling wind of the park, the sudden screech of Miller's tires, and then the venom. They heard Miller's voice, distorted by his own arrogance, calling Sarah, "girl." They heard the sickening thud of her body being slammed against the cruiser. And most heartbreaking of all, they heard the frantic, terrified wails of baby Maya, left alone in a stroller, while a man with a badge laughed at her mother's attitude. Sarah closed her eyes as the audio finished. "He didn't know I was a judge," she whispered, "but that shouldn't matter. If I were a nanny, if I were a housekeeper, if I were anyone else, he still would have done it, and that is why he has to be destroyed." Inside the precinct, the police chief was huddled in a back office with a high-priced PR consultant. "We call it a standard identification procedure," the consultant suggested. "Tell the press she was loitering in a high-crime prevention zone and refused to cooperate. We express regret for the misunderstanding and move on." The chief nodded, clutching at the straw. He thought he could control the narrative. He thought he could bury the dark side of the Oaks under a pile of bureaucratic paperwork. But he had forgotten about the power of the silent observer. Mrs. Higgins, the neighbor from down the street, had never liked the police. She had spent 40 years watching them give her sons random tickets and follow her husband home. When she saw Miller take down the woman from the Sinclair estate, she didn't just film it, she understood the value of it. While the chief was preparing his lies, Mrs. Higgins was sitting in her kitchen, hitting send on an email to the lead investigative reporter at a national news network. By 6 p.m., the chief's standard procedure statement was dead on arrival. The national news opened with Mrs. Higgins' footage. The world watched in high definition as a white officer brutalized a black woman in broad daylight, while a baby screamed in the background. The contrast was too sharp, the injustice too loud. The dark side of the Oaks wasn't a secret anymore. It was the top trending topic on the planet. Shibrawa. While the world was screaming for his badge, Officer Miller was sitting in the dark of his own kitchen. The only light came from the flickering screen of the television in the other room, where he could hear his own voice being played back to him over and over again. He reached for a bottle of bourbon, his hands shaking so violently the glass clattered against his teeth. His phone sat on the table, a glowing brick of betrayal. He had sent 30 texts to his fellow officers, his brothers in blue. Only one had replied. The message was short and cold. "You're on your own, Miller. Don't call this number again." Even the union representative, the man Miller paid monthly to protect him from situations exactly like this, had told him that the optics were too bad. He realized that the blue wall wasn't a fortress, it was a cage. They were going to throw him to the wolves to save the rest of the pack. He looked at his uniform, draped over a chair. He had felt like a god in that polyester. He had felt like he owned every street he drove down. But as the sound of a distant siren grew closer to his house, he realized he didn't own anything. He was just a man who had made the mistake of thinking his badge was a license to hate, and the moon was finally coming out to expose him. Years have passed since that cold morning in the Oaks. The yellow police tape is gone, the sirens have faded, and the headlines have moved on to other scandals. But for Sarah Jenkins, the memory of the steel against her wrists serves as a permanent reminder of why she does what she does. Sarah didn't move out of the neighborhood. She didn't let the shadows drive her away. Today, she still walks those same oak-lined streets. But she doesn't walk them as a victim, and she doesn't walk them as a mystery. She walks them as a beacon. Little Maya is no longer the crying infant in a stroller. She is a sharp-eyed young girl who holds her mother's hand with pride. She knows that her mother didn't just win a lawsuit, she changed the very fabric of the world they live in. Sarah taught her that true power isn't about the mansion you own or the title on your door. It's about the courage to remain standing when someone tries to force you to your knees. Officer Miller's name is now a footnote in legal textbooks, a warning to those who believe a badge is a shield for bigotry. But Sarah's name? Her name is carved into the foundation of a new era of justice. She proved that when the dark side of humanity tries to swallow you whole, you don't have to disappear. You can choose to be the moon, reflecting the light, exposing the truth, and guiding the way for everyone still walking in the dark. In the end, Miller thought he was arresting a nobody. He didn't realize that in the eyes of justice, there is no such thing as a nobody. We all have a story, we all have a voice, and as the people of the Oaks eventually learned, some voices are loud enough to bring down empires. This story is a reminder that the truth never stays buried forever. It's a reminder that resilience is the greatest weapon we have against injustice. If Sarah's journey moved you today, if you believe that no one should ever be judged by the color of their skin or the shadows they walk through, then I have a small request. Hit that subscribe button right now and join the dark side of Luna. We are building a community of people who care about the truth, who celebrate the unsung heroes, and who aren't afraid to look into the shadows to find the light.